thank you for coming to the Dean Seminar. As regular attenders know, I just love these things because I get to think about something else besides budget and boring stuff like that. So I'm very pleased to introduce Chuha today, and I still remember very well reading her dossier, and it was such a pleasure because of the work that she does is so innovative and interdisciplinary. That I was really quite amazed at some of the things that she does. She comes to us, she got her PhD at the University of Miami, and she was just tenured and promoted, so congratulations. She's been fairly consistent in the themes that she's pursued in Irish literature, and the tying together of trauma studies with modern Irish drama, I think, is just very ingenious to put those two things together. So without further ado, Chu, if you come up and talk to them. We'll listen and then ask me questions.
Okay, so welcome to this seminar, and I'm very happy you are here to see those familiar faces. And today our topic is trauma studies and modern Irish drama. And if you know me personally, actually, you will know, I'm a pessimistic person, by nature, and I'm preferring dark things. That's why I'm very much into, Irish studies and also post-colonialism and now trauma, because they are all pretty dark. So that's my taste. But of course, there are some other reasons. And today I'll firstly, briefly review the history of trauma studies, like in the psychological, historical, and literary fields. And then I'll just, we will use a few of the Irish plays as an example to demonstrate how the Irish writers, kind of address the traumatic events in their histories. Okay. Now, when we are talking about the trauma studies, and from the very beginning, we have to really contend with the tendency to forget, and that kind of a tendency is existing on every level. Like from the country, the nation, they also tend to forget because they want to let go what has happened that is unpleasant so that the country can move on, right? And for the perpetrators, they also do everything they could to promote forgetting. And for the victims, it's also very hard for them to remember, right? It's very painful. So they also they wish they could forget. So that's also why the Judith Herman, and in her book, Trauma and Recovery, she's talking about the study of psychological trauma has a curious history, one of episodic amnesia. So there's a periods of active investigation, but there are also periods of oblivion, and they are totally alternating. In order to have the active investigation, we really need a social context. And the context that really gives support to the victims, to the survivors or the witness, in order for them to speak out. So that context is always created by the political movement. So it's always there's a correlations between the political movement and the periods of trauma studies. And throughout the history, we will have three major, or roughly three stages. I don't want to block your view. And so the first one was the study of hysteria. Like before, the hysteria was stereotypically woman's disease. It's a worm's disease. It's mysterious. And in the late 19th century, the scientists, or maybe how should I say, psychologists and the neurologists, they started to look into this hysteria. That is brought by the Republican anti-clerical political movement in France. And then the second stage was the anti-war movement after World War I and after Vietnam War. That is when the veterans, they organized those all the movement and campaigns, and they are started to call on attention on the shell shock and the combat neurosis. So that's when the study of the second stage of the trauma study is about the shell shock or the combat neurosis. And the third stage is, of course, thanks to the feminist movement, and then that call our attention to this trauma caused by the sexual abuse and the domestic violence. And that has been existing for a long time, but it's not until the 20th century that it was revealed, it was exposed to the public. And when we look at the first stage, we had three leading the scientists and neurologists. They are Charlotte, Janet, and Freud. They had their differences in their research, but they came to the same conclusion, or similar conclusion, that was hysteria was a condition caused by psychological trauma. So that was a very different conclusion from before. People will view it as not a psychological disease, but a biological, physical disease. It's because of the womb, right? And there's a wandering womb, in woman's body. So this is make it very clear it's a psychological, disease. And they also find a kind of a very effective treatment that is talking cure. By the historical symptoms could be alleviated when the traumatic memories, as well as the intense feelings that accompanied them, were recovered and put into words. Although there are still, heated debates about, what's really a cure those patients. Is it a release of the intense feelings, or is it integrating those lost memories or those kind of dissociated memories into the normal consciousness? But no matter which side you take, this method is very effective. So they become the kind of a basis. They lay the foundation for the future modern psychotherapy. And the second stage is about the soldiers' shell shock. And actually, the shell shock is a misnomer because different from what the military psychologists believed at that time, it was caused by the exploding of shells, by the bombs, by the external reasons, by the physical causes. They also find out this is a psychological disease. It's a psychological, there's an emotional stress of a prolonged exposure to violent death. So even the soldiers did not express, the bombing of the shells. They can still be, subject to the psychological trauma because their exposure, prolonged exposure to the violent death. So that is almost so similar to the hysteria in the first stage in women. However, here they found it's a very similar, symptoms as hysteria, almost like hysteria in men, okay, in those veterans and those soldiers. And also, because if we're thinking about, the military psychologists, their task actually was to treat those soldiers as quickly as possible so that they can send them back to the battlefield, right, soon to continue, battling. So it was not to their interest that they really want to dig it deeper into the longer term, impact of those, trauma. So we have to really wait until, after World War, especially after the Vietnam War, that we will have a larger scale, more systematic, investigation of the long-term impact of the, psychological trauma of the combat neuroses. And their findings were astonishing. Their findings were just so productive and so great. For the first time in 1980s, and as a result of their findings, they are putting the PTSD really in the American Psychiatric Association. So it's in the first time in the history that PTSD became a disease. It's a diagnosis, became a real disease and diagnosed. And so we are talking about PTSD, but what is really PTSD? Like, it's a post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm kind of using the definitions given by Ruth Lace in her book, Trauma Genealogy. And I think that she put it very nicely. First of all, it's due to our emotions of terror and surprise caused by the certain events. The mind is split or dissociated. As a result, the very violent event could not really be transformed into a past, cannot really be transformed into a memory. And it was frozen, at the present, almost like. So the patient will not be able to present, the event as a past, as something that is bygone, but constantly living and reliving and re-experience, the violent the event. So they also have a lot of symptoms related to the PTSD, such as flashback, nightmares, re-experience, emotional numbing, depression, guilt, automatic arousal, explosive violence or hypervigilance. And there's a lot of accompanying, symptoms to that. So that's, what the PTSD is really about. And now let's move on to the third stage of the psychological study of trauma. In the third stage, we finally kind of look at what is the most common cause of trauma. Is it really existing in the veterans, or is it somewhere else? Before we actually come to to discover the woman's, the trauma existing in women and children. Even as early as in the first stage, like when Freud was investigating, hysteria in women, he actually had an insight into it. He actually claimed in one of his, paper articles says that at the bottom of every case of hysteria, there are one or more occurrences of premature sexual experience. So that's kind of referring to the sexual abuse. And he found as the root cause for the hysterias, for women's hysterias. But that claim was kind of scandalous, like it was horrendous. And at his time, in his society, it was not imaginable. It just could not be tolerated. And so later on, he kind of repudiated what he proposes before. He said, I was at last obliged to recognize that these scenes of seduction had never taken place, and that they were just fantasies, okay, which my patients had made up. So, we have to really wait much longer in order for those so-called unacceptable, silenced, women victims to really speak out. And that's thanks to the feminist movement, the women's liberation movement in the 1970s. And finally, we pay attention to what is the most, common cause of trauma. And we found that in actually among women and children. It's caused by the rape, domestic battery, and incest. It's not really, and also, although in order to see that this kind of the study of the long-term systematic study of the long-term impact of the veterans really contributed to our understanding of trauma, because it really established the body of knowledge we have about trauma. So it kind of makes it easier for us to identify and what women are going through, what they are suffering. But we cannot say that really the fight against the silencing victims and the women are really over, because they are not over. And we can see all kinds of false memory syndromes popping up and saying that no, those are not molested or abused sexually. They are just make up those false memories. But this term, false memory syndrome, is not really a medical term. It's not a, it's a term coined by a mathematician, I think, and because he was accused by his daughter of sexual abuse. So that's kind of of course there's any kind of diagnosis cannot be 100 accurate, but that's not the excuse to shut down those people saying, hey, you are giving us false memories. Now, this kind of medical advancements, the knowledge and the treatment in the medical field of treating, knowing trauma really brings out the other movement, the other, progress trauma studies made in other fields, for example, in history and also in literature. And Dominic Locke is a leading scholar in the historical trauma studies, and he's the author of many books. And in his study, he's mainly focused on the Holocaust. And in his writing of Holocaust, he's criticizing, or he's critical of two major approaches he sees in those historical writing of traumas. And the first approach is kind of a self-sufficient documentary model or research paradigm. So that is kind of aiming for a pure objectification. The historians would be the empirical fact gatherers, okay, and all as a structural formal analyst. So they treat the trauma almost as a very objective, subject. It's the subject of their studies. But although Locke agrees that it is important to have objectivity, it is important to have research. He agrees with those conventional, traditional, historical research, but he does not see it as sufficient. He does not see it as, it's enough. Because when we study trauma as historians, we need to take into consideration your implications in this subject matter, your affective or emotional responses to these subject matters, and how you deal with that. And also you have to take into consideration the testimonies from the victims, from the survivors, right, and the witnesses. And the second approach is almost like the negative mirror image of the first approach. It's the acting out. Okay, Locke is using all these kind of psychological terms, medical terms, to talk about history and history writing, because it's really aiming for the full identification. Like the historians, so sympathizing with the victims and survivors, they fully identify with them, and they are intentionally or unconsciously relieve, maybe I misspelled, the word, relieve the experience of the other. And so those historians, and he saw this is also not so good a tendency, because those historians feel compelled to do that because they don't want to just harmonize what happened. They don't want just to put a close there, and they want to keep it open. They want to call attention to it. They don't want to say, hey, that is gone, so we are moving on. But Capra is talking about if you do that, if you totally identify with, and fully reliving it, you also foreclose some other ways to deal with the trauma, right? It's almost like either or. Either you foreclose it, or you are kind of, perpetuating it. So that's not the way he thinks that should go. And he's suggesting a working through approach, okay, just like in the psychological terms. And to him, the working through, first of all, we cannot, as historians, when we study trauma, we cannot deny our implication in it. We cannot really deny our emotional responses to it. And we need to find a way to deal with it. And we need to find a balance between empathy and critical distance. And also to him, this working through process is not a once and for all process. It's not like, okay, let's treat the trauma and write about it, and then that's all. That's okay. That's over. It's always a repetitive process of dealing with the trauma from different angles, dealing with the different aspects. And in that way, it is similar to acting out. But it's also different because it's repetition. So it's kind of acting out, but it's not really acting out. It's a process that may never entirely transcend acting out, but it is a repetition with significant difference. It's a repetition with some measures of conscious control, critical distance, or perspectives, or passing some judgment, and and also with some limited liability and ethnically responsible agency. So that's not like this. You are totally identifying and totally acting out as it happened originally. So there's a critical distance, and there's a perspective and judgment involved in it, and I believe that he is arguing that because he really thinks history is not just professional or a matter of research. It undertakes to create a critically tested, accurate memory as its contribution to a cognitively and ethnically responsible public sphere. So I think that he views history not only as this kind of objective, study project, but it's really as a public space that that will have a moral obligations to give the truth and also to make a truth claim and also to make kind of not compensate, but do some justice, to what has gone through to people. And in the literature, there are also a few leading figures in the trauma studies, and one of them is Cassie Caruso, and she is the very forerunners of trauma studies in the literature, and she's also an author of many books. And she is actually rereading Freud's study of trauma, and she actually offers many more new insights into trauma, like by rereading Freud. She points out several interesting or insightful points of features of trauma, and the first one is trauma's unassimilated nature. So basically, because trauma is experienced too soon, too unexpectedly to be fully known, and that is the reason why trauma returns, why the victim is haunted by trauma repetitively. And she is arguing that actually trauma is not located in the original event. It's actually located in the return. Okay, and so that's a kind of an interesting point. And she also says that the reason for the traumas to return repeatedly is also, it's almost like an attempt to understand, to re-grasp, to remaster what the victims or the survivors did not understand or grasp at the very beginning, in the first place. So it's always this kind of attempt, but this attempt is never fulfilled. So it's kind of attempt after attempt. It's a haunting, and also to her, she's really emphasizing that studying trauma, we should not just pay attention to the death or near-death experiences, if that's what we characterize trauma. We should also emphasize on the survival. We should emphasize on life, because it's so intertwined, life and death. We're so intertwined in trauma. And not only the survivors, literally, they are turning their, life into a kind of a prolonged death to some extent, but also we need to know about, what survival means to the survivors, right? This is a very important issue to the survivors. They are not only what happens in the past, but what you do with your present. And the third point she is given is, she has a very interesting way to describe trauma. She described it as trauma is always the story of a wound that cries out. So it's almost like trauma as a person has a voice, and it demands our hearing. Like it demands a hearing and our response to that wound, to that voice. It's not mute. It's not silent. And so there's a constantly calling for hearing and response. Now, the Shoshana Philman and the Dory Lobb, they are the co-authors of another important book on trauma. It's called The Testimony, Cries of Witnessing in Literature, Psychoanalysis, and History. And this is the first book that put forward a theory of testimony. So, for example, what do you testify to? Right? Are you testifying to the objective fact, or are you testifying the subjective experiences or your emotions, right? Feelings, and also how to testify. Like in the interview process, what would interviewers do? What they should do, to testify? Do they know the dangers, the traps, in the testifying process? So they put together a theory of testimony, and that's very helpful. And also, for the first time, it defines Holocaust as a crisis of witnessing, as an event without a witness. And that's also, it's groundbreaking to some extent, because Holocaust is not only eliminating all the witnesses, okay, by the extermination, right? But also, if we are looking at before the Holocaust, during the Holocaust, and after Holocaust, all the predominant disbelief, existing among the European Jews, and also the whitewashing or the revisionist version of the histories, how they are covering up and rewriting the history, it's just astonishing. I mean, how the people, in or before or after that event would still cannot, say that this is what happened. And of course, it also talks about literature and art as a precocious mode of a witness, of accessing reality. And it's really elevates literature as this proper form or the sphere to talk about trauma. Because when all other modes of knowledge are precluded, and the literature is like the last place. Because if it's not, if it becomes unspeakable in the historical social sphere, then in literature you still could say something. However, that's kind of a very interesting question, because some would argue the opposite, saying that no, literature is not really the right way to go to talk about trauma. For example, the German critic Theodor Adorno would claim that to write lyric poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. And his fear is about if we aestheticizing, or sterilizing the horror of trauma, we are actually turning the trauma into something that's objective, that's something that is aesthetic, pleasurable, and that really is an injustice to the event or the victims in themselves. But at the same time, he is also recognizing that literature must resist this verdict. Like literature really has to fight against its own limitation to some extent. You really have to be aware of your own limitation and fight against it. It is now virtually in art alone that suffering can still find its voice, and consolation without immediately being betrayed by. So I think he's arguing that as long as literature has this kind of self-awareness and will be so self-critical of how it portrays trauma, there's still a lot of potential literature could do to explore trauma. And both Lacapra and Caruso also talks about the privileges literature has, to deal with the trauma. It's safer, it's more expensive space, and to deal with trauma. And also, I would want to talk a little bit more. Let's transition to Irish literature. And when we come to the Irish literature is not lacking in trauma to some extent. It's full of trauma. If I think about the Irish history, it's just from the Great Famine, the mass immigration, colonization, and the partition, and more recently the Troubles. It's just full of traumas. But it's very interesting that not until 1970s, trauma still remain in the background. Like the writers will refer to it, but it never become the dominant subject matter they will treat. So, but starting from 1970s, Robert Garrett, he is studying the trauma in novels, and he kind of distinguish, between the trauma novels and the novels about trauma. And because it's almost like novels about trauma was what in the past, before the 1970s, because the trauma only in the background, while the novel traumas is really trauma comes to the foreground and become the central part. And so I think maybe that's part of the reason is because of the troubles. And it's more recent, the prolonging, growing pains and sufferings that causes more attention to the trauma. And although literature is very, powerful vehicle to explore trauma, I would argue that theater is even better. Theater is even a more ideal, more privileged place to talk about trauma because it can be performed and acted, right? And also, it has a lot of nonverbal, devices to express trauma, especially when you are struggling with, putting your traumatic experience in words. And so theatrical devices will be very helpful. And also, by watching the trauma played out on stage, the audience also have a more kind of becoming a secondary witness, right? Although they did not witness in the first place, but they become, a secondary witness, and they have this kind of, they assume the kind of moral and political meanings in their watching the play. And so that's, now let's move on to, I want to give you a few examples of the Irish plays that deals with trauma. And the first one is Brian Frill's The Freedom of the City. And that play was a theatrical enactment of Bloody Sunday. If you don't know, about Bloody Sunday, that was an event happened in 1972, and it's a part of the Trouble. And the Trouble was kind of, ethnic political conflict in Northern Ireland, and it was, the Catholics and the nationalists, they are kind of protesting against the discrimination by the Protestant and Unionist, government. And it started with a very peaceful, march, and of course it evolved into the military, strife. It started in 1968 and it ended in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement in Belfast. And the Bloody Sunday, it was a peaceful protest. It's a civilians. They were peacefully protesting against the discrimination, asking for the civil rights. But the British armies actually opened fires on them. And the 26 were wounded and 14 were killed. Immediately after the Bloody Sunday, the English government had a wagering tribunal, and they had an investigation into this Bloody Sunday event, and came up with this, okay, those people who died because they were gunmen, because they were bomb throwers, so there was no, the English armies had no responsibilities for it. They had the right to, open fires. It was not until, 2010, after 12 years, very long inquiries into, to investigate Bloody Sunday again, and we came up with the Savile inquiry. And only then they condemning the British soldiers shooting and killing as groundless and unjustifiable because they opened fires on those unarmed civilians. So Frill's play is really based on the Bloody Sunday. And in his play, there was three protagonists. Okay, I'm trying to find the words. And those protagonists were actually the three civilians died, shot dead, and he brought them back to life, basically. And, and also allow us to see from their perspective, what they have gone through on that fatal day. And this is the ending of the play. And do you want to read it, or do you want me to read it? You can just read it. Okay, so that's how the play ends. And Frill, I think, I would argue that Frill is doing two things like here. The first one is he's really making a truth claim. Like by showing that those three stands, is the laser working? Not really. Okay, so by showing that those three, civilians coming out of this guild hall and their hands are up there, above their heads, they were totally unarmed, and they were kind of peacefully saying that we are just protesting, but they were shot. And the judge is representing the British, the government. And the judge is really fabricating, lies and telling the lies in the teeth of living truth, in the teeth of living evidence. But at the same time, when Freud is, trying to reconstruct the reality, the truth, the fact, he does not really, turning it into this objective project, a historical project. He's involving all of the audience and the actors all together. Because it's very interesting, if we look at here, when they are talking about the entire stage is now black, except for a battery of a spotlight beaming on the faces of the three. So by darkening the whole theater, basically, and that really pulls the audience from their safe, aloof, detached place into, the center of the event. And also they were all just, the audience and also the actors all together. They are all wrapped in this darkness of uncertainty, of suspense, of uneasiness, right? And then the kind of outburst of this 15 seconds, automatic fire, the gun shooting. And that is almost like reproducing the horror of on that day. Like, because this gunfire could come from any direction, like in the darkness, and it could be aiming for everyone that is present in this theater. So by doing that, Freud is really arguing that there's no outsiders. Everyone is really involved in this trauma, in this event. And also there's a very interesting point is the three stand as before, staring out, their hands above their heads. Like by making those three people who are already shot dead, still standing still. And I would argue that Freud is kind of trying to say that there is no rest in peace yet. I mean, there is only long-lasting injustice, right? I mean, that really demands our, hearing, our, memory, and also demands justice. Okay, so it's not over at all. So that's a kind of one example. We can skip this one. And then the next play I want you to look at is kind of Jennifer Johnston's Anadia, Azaria, and Michelle. This is also a play about the trouble, but it's from very different perspective. It shows, because the protagonist is a woman, the whole play is an interior monologue, okay, given by Christine, a wife, a Protestant wife who marries an orange man, and her husband actually joined the Ulster regiment, fight against the IRA, and the husband died, okay, the husband was killed. And in this play, the trauma is not only, lies in the death of her husband, but also lies in her own death, like her death as this kind of individual person. If we read the whole thing, okay, I'll leave it to you. So this scene is really about the funeral. When she is attend the funeral of her husband, and with all kind of orange men and MP were there, and she couldn't cry. Like, that's kind of a very curious fact. Why she couldn't cry at the funeral, but later on when she's seeing herself on the TV, and she cries. And so it's almost like, it reminded me of something, like the traumatized, they have to wake up in horror to the nightmare. To some extent, that is the watching herself on telly is also her waking up moment. And she's waking up, she can only wake up when she sees herself as the other, basically. And when she sees herself as externalized and, objectified to some extent. So I would argue that she is waking up to her own trauma. So her tears is not really shed for her husband, but also for herself, like for her own, almost like invisible, non-existent, life as a married, woman, as a wife, as a mother, not really mother, they don't have children, as a, daughter-in-law, and in her own married life. And also, it's very interesting is, I think the play, if we're thinking about, the tears, the crying is kind of a register of the trauma, right? She realized the trauma. but it's also a departure of the trauma. Because if I think about when you cannot really move on or trying to reconcile with what is lost, what is irrevocably lost, okay, unless you can really cry out, right? Unless you can really mourn for what you have lost and you reconcile. So that tears could also be the gesture of her departure from the trauma towards the survival. And when she's, she's kind of, waking up towards her trauma, but also waking up to a new, life. And in a larger way, if we are thinking about, when we are looking at the play as a whole, we can also see that this interior monologue, I would argue that can kind of function as the same way as, the talking cure, if we are thinking about it in that way. Because by articulating, or even she's not externalizing what she has gone through to another person, but by talking it to herself, that is still a speaking out. That's kind of by speaking out, by talking about what she has experienced, it validates her, it not only establishes the truth or the reality of her trauma, but also it validates her own experiences and feelings. They are not illegitimate, they are legitimate. And so that's a part of the self-empowerment, that plays a role in a self-recovery. And also, by talking about all the things, we can see that maybe it's not a really complete, speech. It's fragmentary. It can be chaotic. It can be, very vague. But still, I would argue that this talking would give a shape to something that before was shapeless, formless. And so, in that way, she could, sort out or identify and relate, her traumatic events to her other events. I mean, in a gradual way. And also towards the end of the play, she is also planning to move out of her house and to relocate to the Belfast. So that's also kind of a clear sign of her, moving on with her life. So I would say that this play is not as simply as acting out, but really there is a working through, involved in this acting out play. And the next one, and should we skip it, or do we have time? Okay, we have 2 plays left. Okay, so this one is the Frank McGuinness play, Observe the Sons of Ulster Marching Towards the Somme. This play is dealing with the subject of the Battle of the Somme. So that is during World War I. And this battle, we know that the Irish joined the British, right, during the World War I. And this battle was one of the bloodiest battles in World War I, because with more than 1 million soldiers wounded or died in that one battle. And also among them, there's 5,500 casualties of the 36 Ulster divisions, men drawn almost entirely from one community in the province of Ulster. So you can see that's how devastating, a blow that this battle was to the Ulster people. And here, this is the beginning of the play. And the play itself is actually is from, the protagonist is a piper, is a survivor of the Ulster soldier. He survived the Battle of the Somme, but all other Ulster men died. His friends all died. And so he was, McGuinness really portrays a traumatized, person. And the whole play is a reenactment of the Battle of the Somme. And that is exactly what goes on in his mind constantly, over and over again. So I'll give you a few time to read it, maybe. And so from the very beginning, we can see he's very much traumatized by this experience. Let me see. If we look at, they are talking about here, It says, I survived. No, survival was not my lot. Darkness for eternity is not survival. So that is how he describes what he is going through in his current life. And we can see that he testifies to this horror of the war, right? And he cannot really forget it. And he also has these obligations towards the dead. I mean, the living feels such a, no matter it's a guilty or it's an obligation, they just feel obliged. They have to testify. They have own so much to the dead. And they literally, and Piper is the example, he literally turns his life into this ongoing testimony of the death, of the trouble, of the trauma. And also we can see there's a very interesting when he's talking about that is not loyalty, that is not love, that is hate. And this is a kind of if I think about what he wants to testify to, right? This is the dark truth about war that he wants to testify to. I mean, because Ulstermen were called on to go to the war to answer the call of the church, of their king, But when they really go to the battlefield, what they really see is this rampant bloodlust, like that wipe out the humanities for nothing. Like that's what they really experience, these daily massacres going on. That just cannot, really put into questions of those war rhetorics about, loyalty and love and things like that. And so I would say this play is really, to the most part, it's kind of, acting out play, because it really shows that the wound cannot be closed. There's no way that the wound is still crying out, because those kind of rhetoricals about patriotism, about heroism, about sacrifice is still very relevant. It's still going on, and so the survivor's voice of his testimony to the darkness of war is still kind of buried under those rhetorics. So that's why it needs to act out. It needs to cry out to some extent. Now the last one, hope I will just finish in 5 minutes. The last play is Sebastian Barry's The Steward of Christendom. And this play takes place in 1932 in the Republic of Ireland. And the protagonist is Thomas. He is the ex-superintendent of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. He's a very interesting character because right now he's kind of confined to the psychiatric institution, so he's kind of losing his mind. And in this play, he is constantly haunted by also his past. Not only mostly it's about his downfall, because he is a Catholic loyalist. He is serving the Dublin Castle, right? He's serving the British Crown, although he's a Catholic, but he's serving the British government. And so he is constantly haunted by the moment when he lost his foothold. He is losing his power. He's basically his downfall. And that is when in 1922, when the Dublin Castle was signed over to the Michael Collins and the Irish Free State. But at the same time, his son, his only son, also died in World War I. So that's also another ghost that is haunting him. He's also kind of haunted by the ghost of his son dies. And also he himself is, in kind of losing his mind. So he's a very interesting character in the way that he, at the same time, is a perpetrator, but also we can call that he has suffered a lot of traumas in his personal life, right? So he's also a victim. So he's a perpetrator and a victim in one. And that raises the question of whether a perpetrator could also be viewed as a victim, right? Whether this is his trauma illegitimate. Okay, and that actually connects back to Piper, if we still remember, the Piper in the previous war, the previous play. And the Piper, although, as a traumatized soldier, but he can also be, to some extent, can also be viewed as a perpetrator, because he may also kill innocent people during the war. And I would argue, to some extent, that it is legitimate to view him as both perpetrator and a victim, because I feel that as a perpetrator, he is guilty of, and this excerpt is about his crime. The Smith is accusing him of this, battle charging, this, killing 4 of the strikers during the lockout. And the Thomas in the later part he's kind of making some self-defense. Oh, I'm doing that just as a good Irish Catholic man, and I'm just doing my duty, I'm doing that. But I feel that he is a perpetrator because he is guilty. And as the superintendent of the police, station, he is guilty of a police brutality. He is giving order to, policemen to battle charging those strikers and cause hundreds wounded and 4 died. But at the same time, he is also traumatized in his personal life. Not only he lost his foothold, but also he lost his only son. And he was treated as a traitor. He was also very deteriorating kind of a mental state. So I don't see it's very contradictory or it's self-canceling to view him as a perpetrator in the public sphere and social life, and also view him as a victim in his personal private life. So I would argue that those two could coexist, but we need to pair. When we are talking about him as a victim, we should also talk about him as the perpetrator, so that we can do justice to both him and also to those people who are subject to his violence. Okay, that concludes my presentation, my talk. Okay, thank you.
My first, were you? No. Okay, so I have, this was so interesting, and I was just like taking massive notes on sort of transferable ideas here. So I wanted to just say two really quick things and then evoke a memory of an interesting conversation that happened in this space in relation to another dean's talk. So one, when Andrea Pino and Annie Clark, the folks who brought us the Hunting Ground movie about sexual violence on college campuses, came here, the one thing they said is the most powerful thing you can do to victims is believe them. And they have a book out now called We Believe You. So interesting to think about. Polson Whitehead is coming on March 1st. That piece of fiction, creative, telling the truth but telling it slant, which is going to link to my next point. He'll be here on March 1st, and I think thinking about the decisions that he made creatively to pull people into the horrors of slavery is really interesting to think about in the context of all these ideas that you drew out. Okay, I have four things. Three, very quickly. To this morning's StoryCorps, if people heard it, there was two children who were remembering being interred, being in internment camps for the Japanese. One was age 5, it was brother and sister. One was 5 and one was 8. The 5-year-old is speaking, remembering that all the children in the family are put in the back seat of the car. They're all weeping, this kid says, remembering when he was 5. The 8-year-old sister says, well, I thought of it as a great adventure. So this reminder that even within a family, the same experience, the truth is, and how we integrate it is extremely messy. And so that brings me to my just very last point that I kept thinking about, and I don't know who was here when Daniel DeGruel gave his talk about, so he was in psychology and was doing research, measurable research about, people who are traumatized, you write about the trauma. He had this, formula that comes from psychology that as a literature person, I was just like, I think all of us were like, no, this isn't true. What his research showed is if you write, for at least 20 minutes about an experience, a traumatic experience, you could get to a place where you felt better about something that had happened. And I think all of us who come at narrative from the humanities really thought, well, okay, but there is no objective truth. And that narrative is always shaped, it always depends on what metaphors you have, your facility. And so it just made me think about how interesting, just sort of what a messy thing you're bringing together here of psychological and trauma study and narrative, because it's the slant where everything, that Dickinsonian, you tell the truth but tell it slant. There's some lingering aspect of, yes, you can get at the truth. And those of us who approach narrative in a more creative kind of way say, well, no, you can't, and in a way it doesn't matter. So anyway, I guess I don't know, just sort of all these ideas are swirling around. It's so interesting to think about in relation to what you said. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think it's a very interesting point that you point out. There's no objective truth, and I think that part of the, Cassie Caruso is arguing that it's really hard or almost impossible to really get, the truth of the trauma. But we should never cease trying. Like, to some extent, that's because, according to you, like the same trauma event, like it may mean different things to the people, right? And when people testify, they are not really testifying. There are some other historians may argue that they should testify to the objective truth, right? For example, there's one example I think La Capra is talking about in his book is a woman from the Holocaust Holocaust survivor, and when she was testifying the revival, not revival, the revolt, in the concentration camp, and she was testifying how many numbers of the chimneys. The historian said that when she recalled that, there were 5 chimneys were on fire, and that is the breaking out. They are burning those kind of, the death camp, right? The gas house, the chamber. And the historian would say, no, that's not right. There are only 4 the chimneys were actually on fire. But, the other, people will argue that she was not testifying to how many numbers of the chimneys, were on fire. She was really testifying to this kind of incredible moment of, breaking this frame of, the concentration of this kind of oppression, right? That's what she was, testifying to. So there's a kind of a, you can argue whether objective truth, is it important? Yes, it is important. We should connect as much information as possible, the document or the written forms or oral form. But at the same time, I think their experiences, their emotional truths, their, voices, their understanding, their subjective, the feelings are also valid, and also add different layers to the traumas and help us to understand it, better. Although we may not get this one, the perfect, best, the understanding of it, but still we are getting closer, I would say, to some extent. Yeah. But thank you for your, and it's great.
Thank you. That's helpful to think about.
Yeah.
You were making the case that you mentioned that one of the risks that literature runs in reenacting trauma or writing about trauma or turning it into narrative is that it makes the trauma into an aesthetic object, right? That's palatable, therefore, right? And you're making the case that these plays avoid that risk to a much greater degree because they're doing this working through process, right? Of reenactment, but also audience.
Yeah, it's an interactive kind of a process between the actors and the audience.
But in the sort of spectrum of all those plays that you talked about, and clearly more that you didn't talk about, would you say there's a range of possibility for how much they avoid that risk? So, for example, I could imagine an audience of one of these plays going away feeling sort of self-satisfied. Oh, I've empathized, right, with those poor people. I've experienced their trauma. And in that sense, the play is helping you experience, but then also feel very like, oh, well, that's done. Now I can go out for a really nice dinner. And I feel kind of good about myself because I've just, I've just taken an interest in the social. Do you know what I mean? So I'm wondering if you notice a range among the plays where some are doing this working through process better than others.
That's a very good question. So I would totally agree with you. I mean, there is a danger, no matter how no matter how the playwrights, arrange the play or portray the trauma, but there's always the danger, different audience may have a different, take. Maybe they will emerge in that kind of a, see the horror of the trauma at that moment. But that moment can disappear when they get out of the theater, when they go back to their normal life. They could feel that's justified. They could feel that they were morally, already, down their share of things. So I think that's a very good question. How I don't have the answer how to address that yet, but I feel that from the playwright's point of view, I mean, they will try to avoid that. They will try to make it, a pleasurable. They will definitely want the audience to sympathize, and also with a critical eyes, to think about. Not only there are difference. Some plays were really kind of acting out plays. They really just want to pull those audience in and then cry and sympathize and identify in with what is happening on the stage. But there are also plays that are really to make the audience to critically thinking about why this happens, and also what we do with it, and what we should look at, and also look at our own circumstances or the problem, because the trauma is never over to some extent. I mean, even it happens in the past, but there's the repercussions, the implications, and the repeating, or even the different forms, is always coming up. It's just like you are talking about the slavery in history, and it's never die, right? The ghost never rest in peace. I mean, it's still standing in all kinds of different forms and in our society. So I think that by let the audience to watch the trauma happened in the past, yes, the audience could go away with content because they sympathized with what happened in the past. But maybe it also would make the audience to think about how relevant the past traumas is to their current situation, to the things happens around them in their lives. I think that's maybe the playwrights, if we are talking about the working through process, that's also, there's no one play that could really do it. It takes so many plays, so many different authors, so many different perspectives, to talk about that, so that the people will be involved and they would feel their own obligations, they will feel their own implications in it, and they will trying to address that issues, not only in the past, but also in their daily lives, to some extent. Yeah, so.
Well, I wanted to talk about a plea for poetry and music as part of the whole picture of what you're doing. When I saw the Adorno quote and about the Holocaust, I thought about the first time I read a poem about the Holocaust, which was in college in a German class, and it struck me very hard because I had so struggled with the shame of being German and having Nazi family in my past, to see someone writing in German about the experience of the Holocaust. And actually the poem deals with the chimneys, that I remember the mimeographed sheet, with the purple ink, and sitting in the library, and I don't know if I cried or if I just sat there and let it sink in, but it so spoke to me so powerfully. And I think of another moment recently when I was at a funeral of a father who had died very suddenly, leaving young children, and the rabbi just read some poems, and it was the best thing because they left so much unanswered. They kind of left you with questions. I'm not sure what Adorno means by lyric poetry, but I want to also suggest that poetry in its spareness can evoke something that's important. And then finally, I wanted to say Bloody Sunday. It would be neat if, when you talk about that, you would also connect it maybe to Bloody Sunday in the United States, which happened in 1965 when at Selma, the protesters were beaten and bloodied on the Selma Bridge, marching for voting rights. So, connecting that internationally.
Okay, thanks. And also about the poetry, I agree. I mean, and there's one very kind of a prominent poet of the German poet. I think his name is Paul Celan. And his poetry was just powerful, and he's writing in Germany, and he's writing about his experience because he was in a concentration camp, and his mother died. I think his mother and father both died because he went away, and then they were captured by put in the concentration camp, and later he was used as a child laborer or something, but he went through and he survived, and he put it in the poetry. I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, the poetry, but there's also a reason for Adorno to argue that it's barbaric to write poetry, because normally we will think about poetry as romantic, kind of you're romanticizing something that is it's something related to the sublime to some extent. It's something horrible, something terrifying, and you turn it into a pleasurable object, aesthetic enjoyment. So that's questionable. But at the same time, I think if you really if you try to avoid that traps, do not kind of fall into that trap. You could use poetry as a vehicle to talk about trauma, and it could be very, very powerful. And I've read some of the Celine's poem, and they were just great. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention too that I think film can make it very confusing as well. The Wind and the Barley is one of the saddest films I have ever seen, but have these beautiful images because the cinematography is just gorgeous in that film.
Yeah.
So like poetry, I think it can convey something really powerful, but it also romanticizes, like, okay, so the Irish, and I'm being careful because Bill's sitting right there, but there is this, and I've got Irish roots, and I'm married to a Murphy, so there you go. There is this kind of tragic image of the Irish people because of what happened to them and as victims and all of that. And I think The Wind and the Barley is a good example of how you easily romanticize it. And when I taught the Civil War, which is our national trauma, students had this very romantic kind of image of it, right? The Shelby foot, PBS, blah, blah, blah. And so I would confront them with image after image after image of horrific death during the Civil War to try to counteract that. So I think there's an interaction that has to go on, you know, within the various arts and representations and literature.
Yeah, there is a lot of film representation of Holocaust that were called into questions. Like the beautiful life is beautiful or some, but there's also there's a almost like there's another film. It's a Shoha. I mean, I don't know whether you have heard of it, but it's a prolonged kind of the film or documentary, almost not really documentary. They are just bringing the victims, the survivors to the concentration the place of a concentration camp, but it was totally beyond the recognition. I mean, there's a very different way, and people will will say that Shoha is more truthfully, or to some extent, more truthfully representing this kind of the concentration camp instead of romanticizing and aestheticizing this kind of the subject of a horror, but really to stare at it in its eyes, right? But some may also argue, it's too brutal. It could re-traumatize, the people, and so there's a different ways, and there's always the ways how we really portray, no matter it's a film or poetry or literature, and there's always a ways to think about in what way we can really portray trauma, and so that we can do justice, but at the same time, we do not really, how should I say, turn it into, into kind of pleasure or morally justified to some extent, for the audience to feel that, yeah.
So this will point to the difference between reading a play or excerpts from it and seeing it, because this felt to me like a documentary. It felt like it did not feel literary, did not feel fictional. It almost didn't seem shaped to me in a way. There were very few points at which I could sort of say, okay, this is a play, as opposed to an account of what really happened. And I think it's really, I mean, it's interesting to think what happens when you're in the theater and you're watching this. That would get sort of some of those aesthetic questions, but also, I mean, the sort of brutality that is to be said. But I had one question, and that is, so I wanted to push back, I think, against Caruth. I'm not sure, or maybe it was
Cassie Caruso.
It might have been Herman, but saying that that the original moment is not traumatic, it's only in the memory. Have you seen arguments against that? Because I would want to say probably it's in the original moment, and I don't know if you've encountered that.
Yeah, definitely. There are people arguing that the traumatic moment is the original moment when the violent event took place, right? Because that's like that's triggers of what is happening, afterwards. But there are also arguing that why the original event is not qualified, or according to Caruso, it's like not qualified for the trauma, because if we look at the definition of trauma, it's very important part is the original event that dissociate, like it's kind of a split your mind, and then when the violent events returns. So the returning and the repetition, the haunting is almost like a defining feature defining feature of the trauma. So that's why, Caruso is arguing that it's not really in the original, but because it has to return, it has to haunt you. Otherwise, some people have very traumatic events, but they did not develop that kind of a symptom of, being haunted, and their normal life is totally invaded and, by the past. So we would not call that as a, trauma, right? So that's also why. I remember, Louis, you are asking?
Actually, we're out of time.
Okay. Oh.
So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.